there is a version of you that no one will ever fully understand. And the question isn't whether that bothers you. The question is, why does it bother you at all? Somewhere along the way, you were taught that being misunderstood is a problem to be solved. That if someone sees you incorrectly, if they misjudge your motives, misread your silence, or misinterpret your choices, then the correct response is to explain, to clarify, to correct the record, to make them see. And most people spend their entire lives doing exactly that. They exhaust themselves constructing explanations for their behavior. They replay conversations, trying to find the right words that would have made everything clear. They send a long message, they bring up the thing again. They soften their voice and try one more time to be understood by someone who, and this is the part no one wants to admit, may never be capable of understanding them at all. But here's what we're going to sit with today. What if the need to be understood isn't a sign of depth? What if it's actually a signal, a quiet, persistent signal that something in you still hasn't found solid ground? The Stoics understood something about this that took centuries to fully surface in modern psychology. They understood that the relentless pursuit of being understood by others is, at its core, a displacement activity. It is what the mind does when it hasn't yet learned to be its own source of validation. We'll come back to that, but first, let's start at the beginning. Think about the last time someone misunderstood you, really misunderstood you. Not just got a fact wrong, but interpreted your character incorrectly. Maybe they thought you were cold when you were actually protecting yourself. Maybe they thought you were arrogant when you were actually afraid. Maybe they saw your silence as indifference when silence was the only honest thing you had left to offer. What did you do? If you're like most people, you felt an immediate impulse to correct it, a tightness in the chest, a running narrative in the back of your mind, a rehearsal of how you would explain yourself if given the chance. And maybe you did explain. Maybe it helped. Maybe it didn't. Maybe the explanation itself was used as further evidence against you. There's a reason that happens. And the reason is this: most misunderstandings are not about information. People think misunderstandings are gaps in data. They think, if I just give them more context, more words, more backstory, the picture will become clear. But that's not how human perception works. We don't experience each other like a document being read. We experience each other through filters. Filters built from our own fears, our own past wounds, our own unresolved stories about the kind of people who behave the way you just behaved. This is backed by something psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. It's one of the most consistent findings in social psychology. When we observe someone else's behavior, we default to assuming it reflects their character, not their circumstances. We overlook context. We assign meaning based on who we assume they are. And that assumption is never purely about them. It is always, in part, about us. So when someone misunderstands you, really misunderstands you, they are not just seeing you wrong. They are seeing you through themselves, through their history, through their expectations, through whatever they need you to be in the story they are already telling about the world. And here is why that matters so much. It means that no amount of explanation will change a misunderstanding that isn't really about what you did or said. You can clarify your words all you want, but you cannot reach inside someone's perceptual filters and reorganize them with a well-crafted sentence. That's not within your power. And the Stoics, more than almost any other philosophical tradition, were precise about the boundary between what is within your power and what is not. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals, words he never intended to be published, words meant only for himself. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Not power over outcomes, not power over perception, not power over how other people choose to interpret what you do. Power over your mind. That's the territory. And it is, when you think about it, already more than enough. But here's the part most people miss. It's not just that over-explaining fails to fix misunderstandings. It's that over-explaining actively makes things worse. Not for the relationship, necessarily, but for you, for your internal sense of ground, for the stability of who you are. Let's slow down here, because this is important. Every time you feel compelled to explain yourself, something subtle is happening beneath the surface. You are, in that moment, treating the other person's perception of you as a higher authority than your own. You are, in effect, saying, your version of who I am has power over how I feel about who I am, and I need to correct your version before I can feel okay again. That's the mechanism, and once you see it, it's very hard to unsee. Psychologists studying self-determination theory, the branch of psychology that examines what makes people internally motivated and psychologically healthy, have found something consistent. People who are externally oriented, meaning people who organize their sense of self around how others perceive them, report significantly higher levels of anxiety and lower levels of well-being, even when others think highly of them. The problem isn't the reception. The problem is the dependency on the reception. And over-explaining is one of the purest expressions of that dependency. Think about it from a different angle. When you genuinely know who you are, when your sense of self has roots deep enough that a misunderstanding doesn't shake them, you don't feel that urgency. You might feel a mild wish to be understood, the way you might wish for good weather. But you don't feel threatened. You don't feel that clawing need to set the record straight before you can breathe again. That absence of urgency is not indifference. It is groundedness, and it looks, from the outside, almost exactly like confidence. That rare, non-performative kind that doesn't announce itself or demand anything. Epictetus, who was born a slave and who understood better than most what it meant to have no control over your external circumstances, put it this way: seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life. Now apply that to perception. Seek not that others should see you as you wish to be seen. Wish instead that their perception, whatever it is, simply is what it is, and proceed accordingly. This isn't resignation. This isn't giving up. It is the most sophisticated form of selective attention ever developed. You are deciding actively and deliberately where your finite mental energy goes, and you are deciding that it does not go toward managing other people's internal narratives about you. But there's a deeper question underneath all of this, and it's the one that makes most people uncomfortable. When you feel compelled to explain yourself, when the urge is strong enough that you can feel it physically, what, precisely, are you trying to protect? Ask yourself that honestly. Most people, when they sit with the question, find the same answer. They are not really trying to protect the truth. The truth, if they are honest, already exists independently of what the other person believes. The truth doesn't need defending. It doesn't become less true because someone fails to recognize it. What they are actually trying to protect is an image, a specific version of how they appear in someone else's mind. And that version, that image, has been granted so much importance that its distortion feels like a genuine threat. This is where Stoicism gets uncomfortable, because the Stoic tradition asks you to look at that image and ask a harder question. Why does it matter so much? Not as an accusation, as a genuine philosophical inquiry. The Stoics distinguished between two categories of human concern. The first category they called up to us, our judgments, our intentions, our responses, our character. The second category they called not up to us, external events, other people's behavior, outcomes, reputation. And they were very clear, almost relentlessly clear, that suffering comes not from what falls in the second category, but from mistaking the second category for the first. When you treat your reputation, the image of you in other people's minds, as if it were your responsibility to manage and protect, you are making exactly that mistake. You are taking something that is fundamentally not up to you and treating it as if it were a vital part of your inner domain. And then you are suffering accordingly. Here is the paradox. The people who spend the least energy managing their image often end up with the best one. Not because the world rewards indifference, but because the absence of that anxious managing quality, the quality that drives the over-explaining, the justifying, the need for approval, creates a kind of presence that is genuinely rare and genuinely compelling. You've met people like this. They don't rush to explain themselves. When they're misunderstood, they don't collapse or scramble. They might gently offer a correction if it seems, but if it doesn't land, they let it go. And something about that, something about their willingness to be misunderstood without being destabilized by it, makes you trust them more, not less. So here is where we are. You cannot explain your way into being understood by someone who is seeing you through their own unresolved story. The mechanism of over-explanation doesn't protect your image. It slowly erodes your ground. And the thing you are defending, when you feel that urgency, is not the truth. It is a version of yourself that was always, in some sense, borrowed from other people's perceptions. In part 2, we go deeper. We look at what silence actually does, not as avoidance, but as one of the most precise instruments of self-mastery available to you, and why the Stoics, from Zeno to Seneca, understood that the person who is comfortable with being misunderstood is the most dangerous kind of person in any room. Not dangerous in the way you might think. There is a silence most people are terrified of, not the comfortable kind, not the peaceful kind, the silence that exists when someone has just misunderstood you, and you have chosen not to fill it. In part 1, we looked at why over-explaining fails, why no amount of clarification can reach inside someone's perceptual filters and rearrange them, why the urge to explain yourself is often not about truth at all, but about protecting an image, a version of yourself that exists in someone else's mind and has been granted far too much power over your internal state. But understanding why explanation fails is only the first layer. The deeper question is this: what do you do instead? And the answer the Stoics gave is one that most people, even today, find genuinely difficult to accept. Not because it's complicated, because it requires something most of us have never been taught to practice. It requires learning to be comfortable inside that silence, to sit with being misunderstood without collapsing, without scrambling, without reaching for the explanation like a life raft. And here's what almost no one tells you about that silence, about what it actually does, both to you and to the room around you. Pay attention to this. There is a particular kind of silence that most people are afraid of. Not the comfortable silence between people who know each other well. Not the peaceful silence of being alone, but the silence that exists when someone has just misunderstood you and you have chosen not to fill it. That silence has a weight to it. Most people find that weight unbearable, so they fill it, they explain, they elaborate, they add context, they apologize for things they didn't do, they rephrase and retry until they can feel the tension ease. But here's what's actually happening in that silence. When you choose not to fill it, when you sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood and make no move to correct it, you are performing one of the most powerful acts of self-mastery available to you. You are demonstrating to yourself that your sense of who you are does not depend on the other person's corrected understanding. You are proving to your own nervous system that a misunderstanding is not a threat. It is simply a feature of the world. This is where everything changes, because the nervous system learns from experience. If every time you are misunderstood, you rush to explain, you rush to reduce the discomfort, your nervous system learns that misunderstanding is dangerous. It learns that the discomfort is a signal that something is wrong and must be fixed. And every time you act on that signal, you reinforce it. You train yourself to be triggered by misunderstanding. But if you practice sitting with it, if you let the silence be what it is and move through it without collapsing, your nervous system learns something else. It learns that you are safe even when someone has the wrong idea about you. It learns that your identity is not stored in other people's perceptions. And gradually, over time, the trigger weakens, the urgency fades, and you find yourself operating from a different place entirely. Zeno of Citium, who founded Stoicism in Athens around 300 BCE, reportedly said very little for years after becoming a student of philosophy. He was known not for what he said, but for how he listened. And when students asked him why he spoke so rarely, he pointed to his 2 ears and his 1 mouth and suggested the ratio was instructional. But there's something deeper in that image than just advice about listening. Zeno understood that silence is not the absence of thought. It is often the presence of clarity. When you don't feel compelled to fill every gap with explanation, you create space, space in which others must sit with their own assumptions, space in which you can observe rather than react, space in which your own mind can settle and clarify rather than performing for an audience. And in that space, something interesting often happens. People tend to fill it themselves. They reconsider their judgments. They question their assumptions. Not always, not reliably, but often enough that the silence turns out to have been more persuasive than any explanation would have been. There is a concept in negotiation and communication theory called the power of the pregnant pause. Studies show that in high-stakes conversations, the person who is comfortable with silence almost always has more influence than the person who feels compelled to keep talking. Silence creates pressure, but it only creates pressure for the person who is afraid of it. If you are not afraid of it, if you have made peace with the discomfort of being misunderstood, then silence becomes your ground, not your vulnerability. But here's the part most people miss about this. There's a misunderstanding about Stoicism that has followed the philosophy since its earliest days. It's the idea that Stoic detachment means not caring, that the Stoic ideal is the emotionless sage, unmoved by love, unmoved by loss, unmoved by what others think or feel. This is not what the Stoics taught, and it's worth getting clear on this, because the distortion matters. The Stoic goal was not the absence of feeling. It was the absence of being ruled by feeling. Those are radically different things. Marcus Aurelius grieved his children. He wrote about longing. He admitted to frustration and exhaustion. He didn't claim to be beyond emotion. He claimed to be practicing. Always practicing. The art of not letting emotion make his decisions for him. The same is true here. Choosing not to explain yourself is not the same as not caring whether you are understood. Of course you care. Human beings are built for connection, and genuine understanding between two people is one of the most profound experiences available to us. To feel truly seen, not just observed, but actually seen, is something worth wanting. The Stoic move is not to stop wanting it. It is to stop requiring it, to stop treating it as a precondition for your own stability, to let it be something you value without making it something you depend on. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything about how you move through the world. When you stop requiring understanding, you become capable of something that constant self-explanation prevents: genuine curiosity about the other person. When you're not busy managing their perception of you, you can actually pay attention to them. You can hear what they're saying without filtering it through the question of what it means for your image. You can be present in a way that is almost impossible when your primary agenda is being correctly seen. And here's the irony. This quality, this lack of agenda, this presence, this willingness to just be in the interaction without needing something from it, is precisely what makes people feel genuinely understood themselves, which means that your willingness to be misunderstood, your freedom from the need to control perception, may be one of the most connective things you can bring to a relationship. The people who make you feel most understood are rarely the ones talking about themselves. They are the ones listening to you with their full attention. And full attention is only possible when you're not performing. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius, put it this way: "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." And when it comes to being misunderstood, he was precisely right. The actual experience of being misunderstood, the event itself, is usually brief and mild. What produces the suffering is the story that follows, the replay, the rehearsal, the imagined consequences, the catastrophizing about what it means for how people see you, for your relationships, for your standing in the world. The event takes seconds, the suffering takes hours, sometimes days, and all of it happens not in the world, but in the mind. So, let's hold what we've built here. Silence is not weakness. It is not avoidance. In the right moments, it is the most precise instrument of self-mastery available to you. Every time you sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood and make no scrambling move to fix it, you are training your nervous system towards something rare, a groundedness that does not depend on external correction. And the Stoic position is not cold detachment. It is something warmer and more difficult. It is wanting connection deeply while refusing to make your internal peace conditional on achieving it. These are the conditions in which real presence becomes possible. Real listening, real relationships, not built on your constant management of how you appear, but on the slow, undramatic accumulation of who you actually are. In part 3, we bring it home. We look at the historical figures who understood this principle at the highest stakes, and we work through the actual practice. What you do with the impulse to explain when it arises. Why your words carry more weight when you've learned to hold them back. And what it feels like on the other side of all of this, in the quiet that develops when you finally stop needing the world to see you correctly. That quiet is worth understanding before you arrive there. Socrates was offered a way out. He could have explained himself differently. He could have softened his words, proposed exile, said whatever his accusers needed to hear. He chose not to. And that choice, that refusal to trade who he was for how he was perceived, is still being studied 2,500 years later. In part 1, we established the foundation. Most misunderstandings are not about information. They are about perception, filtered through the other person's history, fears, and the story they are already telling about the world. And over-explaining does not repair that filter. It often makes things worse, quietly training you to treat your own inner stability as something that requires external approval before it can exist. In part 2, we went deeper into the silence that most people are afraid to sit with, into the difference between not caring and not depending, into the Stoic understanding that wanting connection and requiring it are two entirely different conditions, and that the freedom from the second is what makes the first truly possible. Now we reach the final layer. How do you actually practice this? What do you do in the moment when the impulse to explain arrives, when the tightness is there, the narrative is running, and every part of you is reaching for the message, the phone, the conversation? And beyond the practice, what does it actually feel like when it becomes natural, when you no longer have to work at it because you've crossed some invisible threshold and arrived somewhere different? That's what this part is about. But we start with a story. History has a particular relationship with the people who refuse to over-explain themselves. Socrates, on trial for his life, gave a defense, what we now call the apology, that many historians read not as a genuine attempt to persuade his accusers, but as a statement of principle. He chose to speak truth rather than say whatever would save him. He was offered the chance to propose exile as an alternative sentence. He declined. He knew what choosing to be truly understood by his accusers would have required. It would have required him to become someone else, and he found that price too high. His last words, as recorded by Plato, were essentially a refusal to grant the event more weight than it deserved. The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our separate ways. I to die, and you to live. Which of these two is better? Only God knows. Not a defense, not an explanation, a statement of equanimity in the face of the ultimate misunderstanding. Now, most of us will never face anything remotely approaching that situation, but the principle scales. Every time you face someone who misunderstands you, whether it's a colleague, a family member, a stranger on the internet, you are in miniature facing the same choice Socrates faced. You can spend your energy trying to be understood by people who may not be capable of it, or you can spend your energy being, as clearly and as consistently as possible, who you actually are. And here is why this matters in ordinary life. When you stop over-explaining, you begin to notice something. The people who genuinely care about you, the ones who are actually paying attention, tend to understand you better than you think, and often without much explanation at all. They pick up on who you are through the accumulation of small moments, through consistency, through the way you treat people when nothing is at stake, through the quality of your attention when they speak. Understanding in those relationships doesn't require construction. It develops naturally the way trust develops, not through a single conversation, but through time. The relationships where you feel compelled to explain yourself constantly, those are often telling you something. They are often relationships where the other person's default perception of you is misaligned enough that maintenance requires constant effort. And the question worth asking is not how to explain better. The question is whether that gap is something that can be bridged at all, and whether the energy required to bridge it is being taken from somewhere else that matters more. Your energy is not infinite. Your attention is not infinite. Every hour spent managing a perception, crafting the explanation, sending the message, relitigating the conversation, is an hour not spent building something, thinking something, creating something, or simply being present to the actual substance of your life. The Stoics were ruthless about this. Not cruel, but precise. They understood that a life of value is built through directed attention, and that directed attention requires choosing what does not receive it. Seneca's letters are full of this urgency. He wrote, and there is a slight tremor in the writing, the tremor of a man who knows he is aging. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. What are you wasting yours on? This is not something you simply decide to do and then do. The pull toward explanation is deep. It is wired into the social animal that you are. It is reinforced by years of conditioning in environments where your approval rating had real consequences. In childhood, in school, in early professional life, in every context where how you were perceived determined what you received. You don't undo that overnight, but you can begin to work with it. And working with it starts not with suppressing the impulse, but with understanding it. The next time you feel that urgent need to explain yourself, that tightness, that running narrative, that compulsion to send the message or have the conversation, pause, not to stop yourself from doing it, just to look at it for a moment. Ask yourself, what am I afraid will happen if I don't explain? Be specific, not a vague, things will go badly, but the actual scenario. Will they think you're dishonest, incompetent, unkind, cold? And then, this is the important part, ask whether that matters, not whether you would prefer them to think otherwise, whether it genuinely matters to the trajectory of your life and the quality of who you are. In most cases, the honest answer is no, not really, not in any lasting way. The feared consequence, when you hold it up to the light, tends to be smaller than the energy you are about to spend preventing it. This is what Marcus Aurelius was doing in his private journals. He was not writing philosophy for posterity. He was writing training material for himself. He was working daily through the process of catching his own reactions before they became actions. He wrote things like, "Someone did something you didn't like. So what? Move on." Not because he didn't have feelings about it, but because he was practicing the discipline of not granting those feelings executive authority over his behavior. You can do the same thing. You can catch the impulse to over-explain and, instead of suppressing it or acting on it, simply observe it, note it, give it a name if that helps. There's the need for approval again. And then let it pass without feeding it. Over time, and this is consistent with what cognitive behavioral psychology calls exposure with response prevention, the impulse weakens. Not because you've trained yourself to be indifferent, but because you've accumulated enough evidence that the feared outcome doesn't materialize, that you survive being misunderstood, that your sense of self does not depend on their corrected perception, that you are, in fact, okay. And here is the unexpected gift that comes with this practice. When you stop compulsively explaining yourself, your actual words carry more weight. When you do choose to explain something, when you decide that a particular misunderstanding is worth addressing, that a particular relationship deserves the clarity, the explanation lands differently. It is received differently because it comes from a place of choice rather than anxiety. Because it is clear and direct rather than defensive and layered. Because the person receiving it can feel on some level that you are not seeking anything from them in the exchange. Clarity given from a place of security sounds entirely different from clarity given from a place of fear. People feel the difference, even when they can't name it. And this is why it matters. There is a particular kind of quiet that develops when you stop needing to be understood by everyone. It's not the quiet of resignation. It's not the quiet of someone who has given up on connection, or buried their feelings, or decided that people aren't worth the effort. It's a different quality entirely. It's the quiet of someone who knows where they stand. When you don't need the other person's understanding to feel okay about yourself, the interaction becomes cleaner. You stop performing. You stop pre-calculating how your words will land. You stop moving through conversations like a person navigating a minefield. And something in you begins to relax. Not all at once, but gradually, like a fist that has been clenched for a very long time, slowly opening. You start to notice things you were too busy performing to notice before. The actual texture of the conversation. The person in front of you, not the version of them you are trying to influence, but the actual human being in the room. The space between words, the things that are being said under the surface of what is being said, and your relationships, the ones that matter, begin to deepen, not because you've become more transparent, though in some ways you have, but because you've become more present. You're no longer half absent, running your internal script of how to be perceived correctly. You're here, fully here. The Stoics didn't promise happiness. They promised something they considered more durable. Eudaimonia. A word usually translated as flourishing or well-being, but which captures something more specific. The experience of living in alignment with your own deepest nature, of being fully what you are, rather than performing a version of yourself for an audience that may never truly see it. That flourishing doesn't come from being understood. It comes from understanding yourself clearly enough that the opinions of others, while perhaps interesting, are no longer the weather in your inner world. So, back to where we began. There is a version of you that no one will ever fully understand. And now, perhaps, the question lands differently, not as a problem, not as a failure of communication, not as evidence that you haven't explained yourself well enough, or clearly enough, or often enough, but as a simple, neutral fact about the nature of human perception, and as an invitation to stop spending your life trying to resolve the irresolvable, to stop granting other people's misunderstandings the power to disturb your ground, to stop treating your reputation, the story others tell about you, as if it were something you were responsible for curating and maintaining at all costs, and to start, just start, investing that energy into the one thing that is always within your power, being, as clearly and consistently as you can, exactly who you are. Not for anyone else, not to be understood, not to be approved of, just because that is the only life that actually belongs to you. Save this. Come back to it on the day when the need to explain yourself feels impossible to resist. That's the day it will matter most.